The grandiose palaces of the Ottoman Empire, with their marble columns and golden domes, told one story of power, wealth, and majesty. But beneath the shimmering facade of opulence lay a far darker reality. An empire governed not only by laws but by the brutal enforcement of those laws. The Sultan's throne was not just a symbol of divine right, it was a symbol of fear. The Ottoman Empire, at its height, spanned 3 continents, but its rule was not maintained by diplomacy alone. To truly control an empire of such size and diversity, the Sultan had to ensure that the people feared him, obeyed him, and respected his will. Public humiliation and torture were key methods in ensuring the obedience of the empire's vast population. These methods were not just about punishment. They were about sending a clear message. Disobedience would not be tolerated, and rebellion would be crushed in the most painful way possible. The empire's justice system, while sophisticated in many respects, often descended into cruelty and spectacle. The threat of pain, public shaming, and death was woven into the fabric of Ottoman law. The process began with the defiance of law, and the law in the Ottoman Empire was absolute. The Sultan, seen as the protector of both state and religion, demanded not just political obedience but moral conformity. Any act of disloyalty, blasphemy, or even disobedience to imperial edicts could result in public shame or torture. The message was clear. The empire's strength relied not just on arms, but on the fear instilled by public suffering. In the public squares of Istanbul, Cairo, or Damascus, executions were not quiet affairs. They were grand spectacles meant to demonstrate the Sultan's power and deter the masses from ever considering rebellion. The executioner, known as the Chelit, was an infamous figure, a man tasked with carrying out the Sultan's brutal will. Public execution was often preceded by humiliation. Criminals, political enemies, and even traitors within the royal family were often paraded through the streets in chains. Their crimes would be read aloud for all to hear. This public shaming was a form of psychological punishment meant to ensure that not only the criminal, but also the entire population understood the consequences of disobedience. One of the most infamous punishments was the impalement of traitors. Those who betrayed the Sultan or the empire's laws were often impaled publicly, the act so gruesome and dramatic that it sent waves of terror through the population. The victims would be dragged through the streets on the back of a cart, and once impaled, their bodies would be left as a warning for days, sometimes even weeks. This gruesome spectacle, often conducted in the most populated areas of the empire, was meant to show the people the absolute finality of rebellion. It was a warning that defied time. It was not just about the punishment of one man, but about the prevention of any future disobedience. For lower offenses, public flogging and branding were used to humiliate and degrade those who had broken the law. These punishments were carried out not in the shadows but under the gaze of the public, meant to leave the person with both a physical and emotional scar. For those accused of theft, their hands might be amputated in the town square. For those found guilty of drinking alcohol, considered a grave sin, they were publicly whipped as a lesson to the rest of the population. The message was clear. The empire was founded not just on law, but on fear. Perhaps the most disturbing form of public humiliation came from the harem, a place often seen as a symbol of royal luxury. Yet, beneath its lavish silks and perfumes, the harem was also a place where women, especially those of lower status, could be punished severely. If a concubine or servant was found guilty of any disobedience or dishonesty, they would be publicly punished in front of other members of the harem. Sometimes, this meant being stripped of their status, beaten, or forced to wear the favdi, shameful clothing of a criminal. These acts were designed to maintain strict control over the women of the empire, who were seen not just as symbols of beauty but also as tools of the Sultan's power. But this was not just the fate of the common folk. Even members of the royal family, those born into the palace, were not immune to the Sultan's wrath. The fear of public execution or disgrace was a constant presence in the palace. Fratricide, the practice of killing one's brothers to prevent them from claiming the throne, was a well-established part of Ottoman politics. The princes, locked away in the cafes, often faced a life of uncertainty and paranoia, knowing that their death could come at any moment as soon as the Sultan saw them as a threat. As the Ottoman Empire moved into the 19th century, the once unchallenged reign of public humiliation and brutal punishment began to slowly unravel. The sultans, once synonymous with power and fear, found themselves facing new pressures both internally and externally. The world around them was changing. The age of absolute monarchs was giving way to new ideas about justice, human rights, and government reform. The Ottoman Empire, once an unassailable fortress, was beginning to show signs of decay. And as it entered the era of Tanzimat reform, the brutal methods of control that had once been so effective started to be challenged. The turning point came with the rise of Sultan Mahmud II in the early 19th century. Mahmud, recognizing the empire's decline and the growing influence of European powers, sought to modernize the state and its laws. His reforms targeted not just the military and administrative systems, but also the legal framework that had sustained the empire for centuries. The Sultan's aim was clear: to create a more efficient, less brutal system, one that could withstand the pressures of a changing world. Mahmud II began the process by abolishing the Janissary corps, which had long been a source of political unrest and corruption. The corps had been the Sultan's most powerful military arm, but by the 19th century, they had become an increasingly disruptive force, refusing to modernize and growing more unruly. Mahmud's decision to dissolve the Janissaries in 1826 was not just a military decision. It was a statement about the new direction the empire was taking. The brutal violence of the Janissaries had long been a hallmark of Ottoman rule, but their end marked the beginning of a new era, one in which military violence was to be replaced by state-controlled modern military reforms. But even with the Janissaries gone, the brutal punishments of the Ottoman legal system continued. The Tanzimat reforms, which began in the 1830s, were designed to overhaul the empire's legal system, centralize authority, and extend certain rights to its citizens. The Tanzimat Firmans of 1839 promised to eliminate arbitrary punishments, protect life and property, and ensure equal treatment under the law for all subjects of the empire, Muslims and non-Muslims alike. For the first time in Ottoman history, the idea of legal equality took root. Sultan Abdülmecid I, who succeeded Mahmud II, was a key figure in the implementation of these reforms. The new legal code began to replace the arbitrary and often brutal methods of Sharia law with a more rationalized and structured system. Public executions and torture were slowly phased out, replaced by more formal trials and imprisonment. The idea was to remove the fear-based system of justice that had once been a cornerstone of the Ottoman government and replace it with a more humane and predictable approach. Yet, the shift from public humiliation to legal reform was not an easy one. The old system had been deeply ingrained in the empire's structure. The Sultan's absolute power was no longer to be enforced by public brutality, but by a new system of bureaucratic control. The transition was difficult and often met with resistance from conservative factions within the empire, particularly the religious elite, who feared that the removal of harsh punishments would undermine Islamic authority. For a while, the old methods still lingered. The Chelate, the executioner, was still a presence in the Ottoman court, although his duties became more limited. Flogging and imprisonment replaced the public amputations and stonings, though in some parts of the empire, these cruel punishments still continued in secrecy, carried out in remote areas far from the eyes of reformers. However, by the end of the 19th century, Western influence had grown significantly in the Ottoman Empire. The empire, once powerful and feared, was now facing the reality of being a sick man of Europe, struggling to keep up with the rapid advances of its European neighbors. The Young Turks movement, which called for more liberal reforms and the restoration of a constitutional monarchy, began to gain traction in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Their aim was to modernize the empire's governance and further reduce the Sultan's absolute power. In 1908, the Young Turks successfully overthrew Sultan Abdülhamid II, who had ruled with an iron fist and clung to the old ways. Abdülhamid's rule had been marked by autocracy, censorship, and the continued use of secret police to suppress dissent. But his removal marked the final shift toward a modern legal and political system in the empire. The Constitution of 1908 promised a parliamentary system, civil rights, and legal equality, drawing heavily on European models. With the abolition of the Caliphate in 1924, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk took charge, founding the Republic of Turkey and implementing secular reforms that would forever end the Fez. Ottoman system of rule by fear. The Sharia courts were abolished and the civil code was introduced, replacing religious law with a secular legal system based on Swiss and Italian models. Under Ataturk's reforms, public punishment and torture became a thing of the past. The idea of legal equality was entrenched in Turkish law, and citizens were granted rights and protections that had never existed before. The Ottoman Empire's legacy of brutal control was gone, replaced by a modern legal system designed to reflect the rights of individuals, not the whims of a monarch. But even as the old methods faded, the memory of Ottoman brutality remains. Public executions, torture, and fear-based control were once integral parts of life in the empire. The empire ruled not through benevolence, but through terror. And the story of how the empire finally moved toward justice and reform is one of the most fascinating chapters in history.